I really don't think that much about the supernatural. I don't really think about, I guess, um, the divine, um, or like the potential for, I guess, the existence of a deity, because essentially I just don't, I guess, have the cognitive software to, I guess, form an opinion about that. And I guess this is just assuming that, I guess, any definition of like a deity that makes it irrelevant. Like I guess I see it as like dependent on like consciousness. So like I guess the deity would have to be consciousness, would have to have consciousness for it to be called a deity. And like I don't know, I guess you could stretch the definition to say, oh, it doesn't necessarily need to have consciousness. At which point I don't know, I don't really see how it's irrelevant. Consciousness is ultimately, I guess, the key factor to, I guess, like most or probably every like theological framework. Because if like I guess without consciousness, I don't know, I don't really think you could have intelligence without, I guess, just having like a very like wacky definition of intelligence. I guess I guess also without consciousness, you can't really have a will. You can't have like a moral will, um, or any sort of will. And then you can't really be a designer because you if you don't have a will, you can't have an intent. And I guess you can't design if you don't have intent. And you can't design if you don't have intelligence and you don't have consciousness. So you can't be an intelligent designer. You can't have a moral will if you don't have consciousness. And I guess then I go back to consciousness. And like, if you don't have that, then I guess the whole framework seems to not really work that well. Like, I guess I just can't conceptualize like any version of consciousness that isn't contingent on, I guess, material existing like in space time. I guess because like when I just think about like consciousness at like the level as I experience it, it's like I've got my senses, I've got my eyes, which my eyes enable me to see, but they also have limitations. So I don't see like everything everywhere all at once. I only see um, in as much as like my eyes allow me to see. I could say the same thing for like all of my senses. They limit what I'm able to perceive. They also kind of help me to perceive like surroundings that presumably exist independently from me. So I guess my consciousness is kind of contingent on, me being like a subject that exists surrounded by things that I perceive. And like it's like if I couldn't see, if I didn't have eyes, I couldn't see. I didn't have ears, I couldn't hear. I didn't have like a nervous system. I didn't have hormones, and I couldn't feel anything, um, etc. It's just like in what sense, I guess, would I be conscious if? And then if you're saying that consciousness could exist in an absolute sense, consciousness exists that isn't contingent on, I guess, any other thing, because it's got to be the basis for everything. It's got to exist independently. I guess all of like nature and our material existence is bound by like space and time. And to say that this isn't bound by that, it just I don't know. I hope I'm making sense, but I'm saying like I would say I'm not really ruling out like the whole disembodied consciousness that it could be a thing. I'm just saying that I can't really rule it, and I can't like make my mind process that, and I don't really see any reason to. I guess for an analogy, I'd say like saying that the world that we live in, instead of saying or like the universe, the cosmos, instead of I guess the traditional like theistic view that somehow the cosmos exists in I guess the mind of a deity, a disembodied consciousness. You say like flip that to like let's say that it exists within a sphere, um, but a sphere is an absolute sphere, meaning it has no boundaries, it has no limitations, and just goes to the sense of like the definition of a sphere like requires it to have boundaries. Like it's got to have like a circumference, it's got to have edges, it's got to have like a designated like radius, a, if it doesn't have like boundaries, if it doesn't have limitations, in what sense is it a sphere? It doesn't have any shape. So can it how can it be like, I guess, the absolute sphere without boundaries? And it just like, I don't know, it's like not so much like, again, I'm not ruling out that like that kind of a sphere could like a sphere without boundaries could exist. It's just like the definition of a sphere becomes meaningless um, when you do that kind of shit. I guess just similarly, I think feel like for me, the definition of consciousness becomes useless when you say that it's like absolute consciousness that isn't contingent on everything that consciousness is contingent on in my experience of consciousness and in every experience of consciousness that I'm even indirectly exposed to, without which I would have no other, I guess, concept of what consciousness is. So why am I still calling this like very abstract thing that I can't understand? Why am I calling that consciousness? I guess why should I rule in that like disembodied consciousness is a possibility? I don't know if you're saying like, there's like order and logic, and I guess doing the whole like transcendental argue or some variation of the transcendental argument, saying like, oh, all these things like logic, order, like absolute truth, your rational mind. Your rational mind, furthermore, being like consistent with like the logic that the world operates on. All of these things presuppose like a divine intelligence. And again, I just don't think that's how intelligence like doesn't produce a reality. It doesn't sustain like a reality. Presumably, the reality that I guess you are perceiving, that I'm perceiving, I guess one assumes that it exists independently. That it isn't just a product of your mind. Um, and if that's the case, I don't. We're describing like an intelligence that operates in a way that no other intelligence operates. So, and again, like I don't know why you're calling it intelligence at that point if it just doesn't work the way that like everything else that we call intelligence works. And I don't like, but I will hear like advocates of like that argument, like call it like a mind at the basis of reality. And I don't know, I think it's like likely that it's, some kind of a code, not a mind, not something with a will, but I don't know, like maybe a computer code. Um, and that's like a gross oversimplification, but I just mean something like I don't see any reason to assume that like that would be personal. I guess the thing that's underlying all of reality, like how can we assume that it has a will? See any justification for assuming that it would have a will, or that it's even like aware of its own existence? Like I just don't see why it would follow any sort of rules that we could, I don't know. Again, like ultimately, I don't like even the computer code analogy because I guess whatever this thing that I'm pointing to describing, like we're saying it's the basis for reality, right? So like the rules of our reality are, I guess, subject to it. It's not subject to the rules of our reality, so I guess we can't. Something that's like so far beyond the threshold of our understanding. I don't see why we would assume like any attributes to it beyond it just being beyond our understanding. But I'm saying like because like in order to logically argue for any specific characteristics, like you need to use logic that, I guess in some sense since you're defining this thing as, you know, the thing on which our logic is contingent. So I do like why would it then follow our logic if our logic is subject to it, not the other way around. So you can't use logic to like say, oh, it's got to follow these rules. And I'm just saying, like, if like the core defining like attribute is that it's like beyond the threshold of like our like human cognition, beyond our cognitive horizon, then like just like definitionally that makes me like unable to think about it and hold any beliefs about it. So, um, wow, it's 12:46 a.m. and I don't know. I can't sleep. Bye.